When We Disagree is a show about arguments, how we have them, why we have them, and their impact on our relationships and ourselves. Rhetorical devices use specific patterns to make words, phrases, and sentences stand out. Coca-Cola, Best Buy, Lululemon, and many other companies use alliteration. And just as is the case with these alliteration examples, many rhetorical devices use repetition to draw attention. There are quite a few rhetorical devices, but whether it's a repetitive consonant sound in Krispy Kreme donuts or something else, it's mostly a matter of cataloging the repetition and figuring out which kind of repetition works for which kind of message in front of which kind of audience. Some of these rhetorical devices actually oppose one another. They're the opposite of each other. Anaphora, the repetition of words or phrases at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences, this is the one that Martin Luther King Jr. was so fond of, is the opposite of epistrophe, the repetition of words or phrases at the end of successive clauses or sentences. With epistrophe, the repeated line's placement at the end of the sentence adds weight to the thought, weight to the sentiment. The repeated words are like additional punctuation marks, bringing the thoughts in that sentence or clause to a memorable close. Think of the defiant repetition of "you should have put a ring on it" in Beyonce's Single Ladies, or the somber repetition of "and I love her" in the Beatles song of the same title. Think of this thoughtful contrast about age in 1 Corinthians. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. Some of the most important words in American history, words millions of us memorized in school, are so memorable precisely because they are an example of epistrophe that in just a few short clauses frame the American Civil War as a fight between freedom and unfreedom, and generally capture the entire spirit of democratic government. Lincoln said at the end of the Gettysburg Address that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. I'm Michael Lee, Professor of Communication and Director of the Civility Initiative at the College of Charleston. Our guest today on When We Disagree is Mike Serazio. Mike is a professor of communication at Boston College. His latest book is The Authenticity Industries. He has also written books on sports and advertising, and his larger research focuses on media production. Mike, tell us an argument story.
First off, thanks so much for having me here. So let me go back to an early point in my career where growing up, I always thought I wanted to be a journalist, and that was sort of a starting point for my career. I had gone to journalism school, and then I landed as a magazine writer in Houston, Texas, for an alt weekly. And for me, being a journalist just seemed like a terrific way to make a career. It seemed like a noble way to pursue life. I also really wanted to just be able to be paid to write for a living. However, what I quickly realized was that a key facet of the journalistic process involves inevitable conflict, which is to say that the journalist's job is to go out and try to find truth about the world. The folks who are involved in those stories want their lives represented as best as possible. And so there's a kind of inherent conflict in between those two things. This simmered over the years in terms of different stories that I did, but it came to a head most acutely when I did a story about a woman who ran a wolf sanctuary north of Houston. It's where wolves go if they're sick or they're abandoned, things like that. And through either incompetent negligence or outright criminal negligence, all of the wolves died under her care. We investigated the story. I wrote it up, put her on the front page of our magazine, our alt weekly. She called me up the day that it ran, and she said to me on the phone, "You've ruined my life forever." Now I'm 21, 22 or so, 23 maybe at this point, and I really didn't want to ruin anybody's life. Certainly not at that age, certainly not at the age I am now.
Right.
That's a tough one to take. That's a tough call to take. A good journalist in that moment should say to that subject or that source, you ruined your own life because of the decisions that you made, but that's not my temperament. And
Sure. So the old adage about journalism is, and I want to see if I can get this right, is that you afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. Is that right?
that's correct.
And to what extent, just taking 22-year-old Mike into account, to what extent did you follow that adage? Was that part of your practice?
Yeah, for sure. That is the classic adage. I believe that's the correct ideal for journalism, but I believe it requires a personal disposition that I did not myself have.
A disposition towards
afflicting people,
towards conflict.
Right, conflict. Yeah. I'm very comfortable with with comfort the afflicted part of that anecdote.
Sure.
It's the afflicting the comfortable, which is journalism's tendency to. Journalism has a reformist impulse. It has a progressive impulse, not in a kind of liberal leftist sense, but in the sense that something is wrong with the world and that one of journalism's jobs is to expose those problems to try to correct injustice. There's a long and distinguished tradition of this within journalism, but it requires a mindset and a disposition that's comfortable with that conflict because it requires exposing problems and it requires, again, afflicting those who are comfortable, particularly if they're undeserving of that comfort. And I just didn't have that within me. I realized that early on.
And just on the ground level, I mean, this means if you're afflicting the comfortable, you need to be willing to, as a human being, go up to somebody who you think is hiding something that sunlight could disinfect and ask them anything, search their property, perhaps talk to people they know, kind of rustle a lot of leaves around them in a way that they're not going to particularly like, and then publish something, perhaps on the front page, that they're going to call you up and cuss you out about, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again, and make it almost into a lifestyle.
Yes.
So if you think about a human who could function, even thrive in that environment, that might not be all of us. And you realize at 22, this was not you.
Yes. And the best journalists have a personality that is inoculated from those things, I think, impacting them deeply. Although, I mean, I've encountered many journalists over the years, close friends, famous people that I've had the occasion to, have sit downs with.
Okay.
And these can be the absolute loveliest, most humane of people, but the best ones are able to follow truth wherever it leads them, even if it means a real conflict with the sources of stories who think that they should be represented in a more positive light.
How, and it's tough to psychoanalyze people who aren't here, but you have a lot of experience in this industry and talking to folks. How do they do that? How do they continue to thrive and maybe even enjoy the process where some woman who's just killed a bunch of wolves calls them up and says, "You've ruined my life"?
Yeah. It's a good question in terms of what the psychology is that is able to do that. Well, look, I think some people are, I think, thrive on conflict. They're comfortable with it.
Sure.
Other people, and again, this goes to my own disposition, which is conflict avoidance to a fault. And I think that the best journalists that I've known are comfortable with that combativeness. I think that it's not just journalism as an industry that necessitates some of that. I think politicians maybe also fall into this same category of encountering conflict in a lot of their daily dealings, but also needing to be fluid and sort of socially adaptable so that, they're able to balance those two sides of that personality. Mm-hmm. But I respect the heck out of people who have that ability to turn off that personal side, right? But at the same time, I want to point something out too, which is that as a journalist, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get sources comfortable with you. So you can't go in and be a real abrasive, conflict-seeking person, because that's going to turn off your source in terms of them being able to give you a good interview or tell you about their lives, open themselves up inviting you into their homes. And that's right. You need to be able to get people to open up to you, which means you have to be likable, but you also have to be willing to be disagreeable at the same time, because ultimately what you have to have faith in, I think this is what gets a lot of journalists through this, is you have to have faith in the process and faith in the ideal that you're there to pursue truth. And truth doesn't care um, about your feelings as a source, as a subject. Truth cares about truth. And that may require breaking some eggs along the way.
I'm going to put that on your headstone. Truth doesn't care about your feelings.
Yes, exactly.
How quickly after the wolf incident did you exit journalism?
Yeah, so I spent about 2-3 years working in daily journalism as a magazine writer.
Okay.
And as it evolved, what I came to realize two or three things that nudged me toward the exits. One was this fundamental personal aversion toward conflict that was necessary in any story. Even if I'm not ruining someone's life, every source and subject that I called up wanted me to portray and represent them in a positive fashion, which is not my job as a journalist. That's public relations. So there was that. There was also my sense that the news business this was the mid 2000s. Really, at that time, it was kind of on the precipice of what would be 2 decades of economic contraction and a sort of business model that's imploded in slow motion. So I had a bad feeling about the industry as a whole.
Yeah.
And thirdly, I realized that my favorite part of the process was when I got to call a professor somewhere and ask them and interview them within the journalism business. It's called the cosmic graph. It's like the paragraph in a given story where the journalist gets to say, this is what it all means in the big picture of things.
Okay.
And I loved having that conversation. I loved talking with professors about ideas. I loved the way in which, ideas guide our world in a really powerful way. And I just thought, maybe if I could be the other person on the other end of that call,
Sure.
and I could be the one doing a journalism of ideas, which is sort of what I set out for my career after that.
So the cosmic graph, just for my own edification, is you as a journalist are writing a story about these poor wolves north of Houston, and then you get into the trees, so to speak, of these poor wolves and this woman. And then you need to kind of situate this within larger conservation efforts or the wolf population. And so you call some professors who might know this stuff, and then they talk about the forest while you have set up the trees. Is that right?
Exactly. And in any, in a kind of daily newspaper story, you might not get the cosmic graph, but I was doing magazine features. And so most magazine features will have a cosmic graph at some point that takes the specifics on the ground, those trees, and puts it in the forest context to make big sense, big picture sense of it.
And when you would feel this conflict, the wolf story is one example, but you sound like it would happen over and over again, just on a less extreme level.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Is that your ideological commitment towards truth seeking would butt up against, and I might be putting words in your mouth here, would butt up against an emotional feeling that to feel comfortable, you would need to behave more like a public relations professional. So your ideology and your emotional relationship to the job were in conflict?
Absolutely. Ideologically, I believe deeply in what journalism tries to do, right? I think that, and I tell my students this because I teach, students who want to go into journalism. To me, wanting to go into journalism, I think, has a similar calling that perhaps like Catholic priests or people who are religious feel in some way. And
Okay.
I feel that ideological calling deep in my bones. I believe deeply in journalism, and I believe deeply in supporting journalism and what journalists do. And at the same time, my personal just personality was disinclined to the pursuit of that larger ideological goal.
It almost sounds like a little, maybe it's over dramatizing this and Lifetime movie networking this, but it does sound real to me as I'm hearing you tell the story, which is you had to admit to yourself that you were not kind of dispositionally cut out to pursue this dream.
Yeah.
In other words, you had to give up a dream and start a new one.
Yes, absolutely. And I felt grateful that I was able to segue from that earlier career and what I thought was going to be, my career for life into this world of being a professor, where I get to do a kind of similar thing, but it's much less conflict oriented. I'm so grateful. I tell my students this all the time. I tell anybody who'll listen to me, I somehow hit the jackpot in life.
Yeah.
I get paid to be a professor, which is extraordinary because I do it for free if I didn't need to pay the mortgage and buy groceries for my daughter and stuff. But, to be a professor is to encounter a world that is kind of like a journalism of ideas in some way for me. And it doesn't require the same personal combativeness that we tend to encounter as journalists, right? Like, students will fight grades sometimes, and that's unpleasant. And, and certainly people feel passionately about their theories and their ideas and their research, but it's not someone's life on the line in quite so
No.
raw a way.
I have experienced, to share just a bit, and I want to get your take on this, that there can be a little bit of an overcorrection amongst academic literature, and certainly amongst academics, where they've become such micro experts on a very small section of society or history or science that there's maybe 4 or 5 people or 50 people on Earth that could actually falsify what they're going to say. And so it's led to a kind of seclusion from the realm of conflict and the march of ideas, that it can be difficult to actually introduce conflict. In other words, so much of it is so conflict avoidant that I would prefer there to be more conflict.
Yeah. Well, I think probably to some degree, the march of knowledge tends to, at least how do I want to put this? Perhaps like the business of academia, the business of trying to get a job as a professor necessitates that you're going to pick some microscopic niche that you can specialize in and really know about, right?
Yeah.
And that incentivizes against floating across disciplines, that incentivizes against
Making big claims,
cross-pollinating from across fields, right?
Yeah.
You're really kind of, especially in grad school, they sort of beat that out of you, right? Like beware big claims, because someone can come at you with evidence or theories or history that will disprove that in some way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think, the more that we are as faculty members and as scholars able to traverse those domains, I think the more rich our ideas become.
Yeah.
Because the other thing about conflict, I guess this sort of goes to where a lot of your conversation on the show might go, but I constantly find myself reminding myself and being reminded that I really probably am wrong about the things that I believe. And it's a constant process of humility that I find, whether it be me observing the political landscape, and I follow politics as closely as I do sports, and just feeling though, I could be wrong about this. For me, there's an intellectual humility that I try to always carry with me, that I could be wrong about this. And I find that like having that sensibility both opens me up to consuming a lot of news content that provides cognitive dissonance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I try not to silo myself in just reading the same stuff that already reaffirms what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's a good exercise, and it's what I try to inculcate in my students as well.
So I'm struck with a kind of fascinating irony here as you talk about exposing yourself to different ideas. The exposure to different ideas is a kind of embracing of conflict that you purposefully got away from. And so where does this kind of continued need to embrace conflict, but in a very different environment, come from?
How do I square that circle?
Yeah, kind of.
So to me, it's all in the distinction of abstract ideas versus people's personal lives, right?
Yeah.
I love nothing more than watching and thinking through the collision of abstract ideas and theories. And, look, is it economic materialism that explains everything about our lives, or is it some sort of Durkheimian community oriented? It's like what's the thing? I mean, and I can come at it from different angles, and I have my own certain biases in this way. Do people have agency? Is it is there free will? Is there is it structural determinism? At the level of abstraction, I love the collision of ideas. I think it's fascinating. When it gets into people's personal lives, which is what journalism operates at, because journalism operates on the ground, right? It operates at the level of someone did this wrong, did this wrongdoing, right?
Yeah.
That's a conflict that I'm averse to, but at the level of kind of airy abstraction, I just find those things fascinating.
I'm going to ask a question that I'm just ripping off from therapists, and I'm curious to see how you answer it. But when you feel the kind of personal conflict over the ideological or abstraction, capitalism versus socialism, Adam Smith versus Marx arguments, how does that show up for you? In other words, where do you feel it? The kind of discomfort over, I have covered something up and you're going to write a story about it. That makes you feel how?
That's a good question. Well, it makes me feel complicit, perhaps, in the pain that might result
Okay.
from an individual.
Like guilty?
Yeah, exactly. So when that woman calls me up on the phone and says I've ruined her life, I can't help but feel some guilt, right?
Yeah.
That even though it was her actions that did it, I was the one that brought it to light, right? Like, if not for me,
Yeah.
her life wouldn't have been ruined. And granted, correlation is not causation, right? But it was me who turned over the stone. And it is that sense of guilt for sure. You know,
And you feel no righteousness there.
no, righteous. I don't have much. I don't place much value in righteousness.
And that was the last question I wanted to ask you, and kind of stemming off of your discussion of intellectual humility, both in your own life and what you teach to students and the way you practice in your writing too. A kind of maybe deceptively simple question. Why do you think you're wrong?
Because, oh gosh, that's a good one. Well, because I've been wrong about many things over the years on many different levels, and I think that past performance is guarantee of future returns in the investment commercial discourse. No, I think that I'm wrong because to be human is to be wrong. Like that's our fundamental fallibility, and I also feel as though when I look out at the world and I see people who are so sure of themselves, this is true particularly in politics, but it's true in other facets of life. When I see people who are so sure of themselves and sure of what they know and sure of what they believe, I just think, read some more stuff. Expose yourself to some more possibilities, You just can't be... it's funny because it probably makes me sound like I'm a person of little faith, I guess. But like I'm actually a very devout Catholic, and yet even whether it's religion, whether it's politics, whether it's whatever thing that people believe passionately, when I see someone really thinking that they're sure of themselves or sure of something, I just think they need to be exposed to more to sort of take some of that confidence away.
Read some more stuff. Sounds like something a college professor might say.
For sure. This is why it's this is why this career and this lifestyle is just perfect.
Sounds like you made the right choice.
I got lucky.
Mike Serazio, thanks so much for being on When We Disagree.
Thanks very much. It's been a great conversation.
When We Disagree is recorded at the College of Charleston with creator and host Michael Lee. Recording and sound engineering by Jesse Kunz and Lance Laidlaw. Reach out to us at whenwedisagree@gmail.com.